You may have heard the same then, and I just share this because it's fascinating reading, but perhaps that's all it is, as any good work of fiction is. But there was a girl in the polka-dotted dress that seemingly got a lot of attention, even to the point where a member of the campaign staff for Bobby Kennedy said that he saw a woman in a polka-dotted dress along with a male companion running out of the pantry area that evening saying, "We shot him, we shot him." And that apparently was corroborated by an L.A. police officer who talked to an elderly couple in the parking lot, seemingly giving the same type of testimony to that officer. Again, any familiarity with the woman in the polka-dotted dress theory?
I've written a lot about war, battle, and when people are in traumatic situations, they see things. It's very hard to reconstruct what actually happens in a battle because when people are traumatized, they have very different memories of what happened. And if you read a clean battle narrative, I can pretty well guarantee you that that's a contrivance that people don't really know. And the same thing happens in a scene like this. People will hear all sorts of things, will imagine all sorts of things. Who knows what the woman in the polka dot dress actually said? Trauma and drama work on your brain, work on your imagination, and they produce impossible results. Again, in this case, I think the conspiracy theories are unproven. A lot of people have looked at it, and sometimes it's hard to finally resolve things. This is particularly true of the JFK assassination. It's hard to know for absolute certain because there are too many loose threads. But I think in this particular case, the loose threads have been pretty well tied up.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
Now, Steve Hughes, 23 years, I believe you told me, with the United States Secret Service, so you weren't on duty yet 44 years ago. So you weren't obviously hands-on in terms of the policies in place for the Secret Service back in those days. But you know the history, and I think you certainly have a good understanding of the differences between the Secret Service protection back in 1968 for presidential candidates and the level of protection that presidential candidates have today. It's a stark contrast, certainly. Tell us about why there was Rayford Johnson, Rosie Greer, and Bill Barry, former FBI agent, who were in charge of the security for a sitting United States senator whose brother, formerly the president of the United States, who had been assassinated himself. There must have been security concerns for Robert Kennedy when he decided to run for president, and yet the Secret Service wasn't providing security. Why is that?
Well, basically, the reason we weren't protecting, there's no law, there's no statutory authority for the Secret Service to protect Robert F. Kennedy, and I do love the history, and I love listening to Art and his recollections of that day, a tragic day 44 years ago, and it's really, for us at the Secret Service, and specifically the division where we work for campaign activities, it's 44 years of protection anniversary today, because on this date we started candidate protection because of this incident. So there was no law, much like going back historically, many presidents were assassinated, and it wasn't until 1901 when President McKinley was assassinated that they realized, okay, we better now act, despite the other assassinations of presidents from Lincoln on through. So that caused Congress to act and create a law where we protected the president after McKinley. And the same here. The only difference is in 1968, Congress acted the next day, and they had Public Law 9331 where it authorized us to protect presidential candidates. And for President Johnson to get Congress to act the next day has got to be some type of record not since matched on how quickly they were able to get protection and the authority for the Secret Service to protect presidential candidates.
And there were 5 presidential candidates at the time, as I understand it.
On that day, within 24 hours, the Secret Service picked up protection on Richard Nixon, on Eugene McCarthy, who you mentioned earlier, also on Nelson Rockefeller, George Wallace, and Harold Stassen within 24 hours. And then, we grew the rest of the campaign that year because anyone who ran for president, we picked up candidate protection on that year. And Since then, the criteria has been more refined to who gets protection, when they get protection, and things like that. But at that time, we acted immediately and picked up any candidate. I think we had 12 candidates in total that election year of 1968.
Did you get any additional resources? I mean, it's wonderful for them to act and say, okay, now we're going to get Secret Service protection, but it's another thing to give you the manpower and the other resources you need to make that happen.
Well, with no notice, we had no manpower to increase to. We did get some funding from Congress, but from what I've read, the agents worked in a tremendous amount of overtime in 1968 to accommodate this. Our field offices rallied the agents, and they provided protection for these candidates throughout the 1968 till the election was over.
So taking off on that thought a bit about who gets Secret Service protection today, I assume just announcing that you're running for president of the United States does not necessarily entitle you to Secret Service protection. What else do they have to do to qualify?
Well, there's several criteria that needs to be met to receive Secret Service protection. The first is that they have to request the Secret Service protection. So that's the first criteria. Now, our Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security ultimately will decide whether the candidate receives protection. There are some guidelines that the Secretary can look into to see whether this person's viable. Ultimately, it's her decision to make. But she does have an advisory panel made up of the leadership of the House and Senate, as well as a fifth member at large. I believe it's the Senate Sergeant at Arms this cycle, who is an advisor on that. But certainly they have to be from a party, a recognized party. As part of it, they have to have polling data that we look at to see if they're viable, matching funds. They have to enter in a certain number of primaries, and these are all criteria for the candidate to meet. Now, last cycle, then Senator Obama, received the earliest Secret Service protection in May of 2007. He requested it and was granted by the Secretary back then. So, it all depends on when the candidate requests. Senator McCain requested much later, into 2008. So that's the most important thing, is they have to request the protection and then meet the criteria. And if they don't meet all the criteria, the Secretary has to deem them as a viable candidate after checking with the advisory committee from up on the Hill.
And if the candidate requests protection, does that include the family as well?
Statutorily, it's really 120 days prior to the election where the spouse can receive protection. They can request to the Secretary for protection for a spouse or children earlier, but that would have to be via executive order from the President for us to then start protection, which did happen last cycle for Mrs. McCain and Mrs. Obama.
There is a candidate for president's election, Bobby Kennedy, who likes to press the flesh. Evan described the mob scenes where people would try to pull him out of the car and so forth. Try to put yourself in that situation 44 years ago. How would the Secret Service, if they were protecting Bobby Kennedy at that time, how would you handle it differently? And what do you do today that might make it a little safer for people like Bobby Kennedy?
Well, the protection that we have, we evolve every year. Every incident we study and we learn from. Certainly, nothing's perfect in an open society. It's very tough for us to accommodate the candidate and their needs to go out and meet the voters, as well as do our job successfully. So there's a compromise every day and every event for all protection that we do. 1968, looking at the photos and looking at the diagrams from the Ambassador Hotel, I mean, certainly we would have learned to have a buffer zone for the crowd there. We'd have an entry and exit way for the candidate to get out that would be clear. Certainly the kitchen that he went through was very cluttered, and no one knew who was who back there. So things like that. Obviously, we would have been much more personnel involved than a couple of athletes, big as they were, and the one private security former FBI agent. So we had more personnel there. We would have worked to advance that site with the staff that week prior so that we'd know where to go, have contingencies. And that's what we're all about, is making contingencies and planning our security efforts well in advance so that there are no surprises and we have a controlled environment for our candidates. Again, the candidates want to get out there and shake hands, and we try to work with them so they can accomplish that. But we want to have a secure environment for them to do it.
When there's a campaign event these days, Would the crowd that we see shaking hands with the candidate, would they have been walked through a magnetometer prior to entering that situation?
Well, at certain points during each campaign, we do use different assets. We increase it as we get closer and closer as we move along. So certainly magnetometers is one of the tools that we use to screen crowds at large events. And I'm certain something like that in June of the election year, crowd that size, we would use magnetometers for. So that would have assisted us. And again, our exit and entry route would have been much cleaner than what he had available.
Yeah, good point. Evan, let me come back to you. As with seemingly all of these types of assassinations, shootings of dignitaries and celebrities, there's always conspiracy theories. And obviously there were many that we heard about with JFK's assassination, and maybe lesser known, but certainly almost as frequent, we heard about conspiracy theories related to Bobby Kennedy's assassination. Help us understand that, and is there any validity to the idea that there might have been more than one gunman or other people involved with Sirhan Sirhan?
When something goes wrong, people have to explain it. And so that's how conspiracy theories get going. People they can't cope with it. So there must be an explanation. There must be a conspiracy. My general belief as a journalist is that we don't have any conspiracies. There are a lot of mistakes, but there aren't too many conspiracies. Not impossible, but they're much rarer than people think. In this particular case, when I was writing my Bobby Kennedy book, I wasn't quite sure how to deal with this, but at the time there was an investigative reporter named Dan Moldea, who was well-known, done a lot of stuff, hard-driving guy, and he set out to prove that there had been a conspiracy. By the time he'd done the research, reached the opposite conclusion. And that was pretty convincing to me. An investigative reporter who goes looking for a conspiracy and comes out the other end with no conspiracy, pretty convincing to me. So I think the evidence from everything I've read is that Sirhan Sirhan was just a loner, mentally unbalanced guy with a political argument and a cheap gun, and that was it. And there wasn't anything more to that. I think the debate still goes on, but I think the evidence is more. It's less complicated than the JFK assassination, where that debate will go on forever. Actually, I think Oswald was a lone gunman in that case too, but that's a tougher call.
You may have heard the same then, and I just share this because it's fascinating reading, but perhaps that's all it is, as any good work of fiction is. But there was a girl in the polka-dotted dress that seemingly got a lot of attention, even to the point where a member of the campaign staff for Bobby Kennedy said that he saw a woman in a polka-dotted dress along with a male companion running out of the pantry area that evening saying, "We shot him, we shot him." And that apparently was corroborated by an L.A. police officer who talked to an elderly couple in the parking lot, seemingly giving the same type of testimony to that officer. Again, any familiarity with the woman in the polka-dotted dress theory?
I've written a lot about war, battle, and when people are in traumatic situations, they see things. It's very hard to reconstruct what actually happens in a battle, because when people are traumatized, they have very different memories of what happened. And if you read a clean battle narrative, I can pretty well guarantee you that that's a contrivance that people don't really know. And the same thing happens in a scene like this. People will hear all sorts of things, will imagine all sorts of things. Who knows what the woman in the polka dot dress actually said? Trauma and drama work on your brain, work on your imagination, and they produce impossible results. Again, in this case, I think the conspiracy theories are unproven. A lot of people have looked at it, and sometimes it's hard to finally resolve things. This is particularly true of the JFK assassination. It's hard to know for absolute certain because there are too many loose threads. But I think in this particular case, the loose threads have been pretty well tied up.
That's good. Art, I'm curious. You take Sirhan Sirhan to the police station. You've made the arrest. You filed the appropriate paperwork. Help us understand what happens then. In a case like this, what agency, for example, is it the FBI? Is it the Los Angeles Police Department? Now that the Secret Service is involved with protection, do they get involved? with the actual investigation and assist with the prosecution of Sirhan Sirhan, who was tried, as you said, about a year later for this crime. Who had jurisdiction at that point, and what happened to Sirhan Sirhan after the arrest?
Just to get everything straight here, I know there was trauma and drama, but I remember everything that happened there. Like I said, this was back in 1968. I was 21 years old. I was a rookie cop, so I really didn't know much about what was going down then. But I know that he was prosecuted in Superior Court at the County of Los Angeles. So I'm assuming that it was he was tried by Superior Court. So he was tried by the regular California Superior Court. I know he's in California State Prison. And I know the investigation was conducted by the Los Angeles Police Department with help from other various agencies. I know that because I remember when they had a Kennedy task force. They call it the Kennedy, the Robert Kennedy little task force they had, and even had a mock-up. They had mock-ups of the pantry and how we walked, because I had to go over there. They asked us, how did you go in? So we actually pointed, we came in through here, and we went here, he was here, we went out here. So I know that investigation was handled by the Los Angeles Police Department. Who else was there? I know I was interviewed by quite a few people. I was depositioned by Sirhan's defense attorneys. I was depositioned by them. And so, like I said, a lot of things were going on. I was being deposed here. I was being interviewed here by, department brass, and everybody wanted to know what happened at that time. But, who was handling it? I know we were handling it. I know he got tried in Superior Court, so I know he didn't get charged federally. So
no, I would think it'd have to be LAPD since there was no statute for candidate protection at that time. So, yeah, that'd be a homicide LAPD.
Different today, though, Steve?
Yeah, the FBI would run with this investigation, working with the local partners, LAPD, if it was to happen today.
Okay. Evan, perhaps you know the answer to this question. Sirhan Sirhan has now been in prison for 44 years since the shooting. Never seen the light of day since then. He's been up for parole 14 times, as I understand it. Fairly recently, in fact, he was denied parole. Do you believe Sirhan Sirhan will ever be released from prison?
No.
I think he's 68 years old now, if I'm not mistaken.
If his parole's been denied that many times, I don't see what's going to change it.
Yeah. Good point. I'm going to do something now, letting our audience have a chance to ask some questions. We have some microphones, some staff with microphones that can come to you. Like you to feel free to ask any question of our panelists that you think you'd like to have them answer. If you just raise your hand and they'll come greet you. Got one over here. There you go.
Mr. Placencia, I know it was such a turbulent time around the nation. I was wondering what you saw as a law enforcement officer following the assassination. How was your daily routine? What was life like in Los Angeles after Bobby Kennedy was killed?
Well, after Bobby Kennedy was killed, my career basically went on because I was still on a probationary officer. But there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of marches. I grew up in the East LA area of Los Angeles, and I know that there was a lot of Brown Beret activity over there. In fact, I think we even had a small mini riot. It was 3 years after the 1965 riot. And I remember that we were sent down to the Watts area for that small riot. And but there was a lot of things going on. I remember we were also at the Century City Plaza. They had a large demonstration there. I was sent there for crowd control. And so there was a lot of activity. I mean, there was, they had a lot of protesting, the Vietnam War. And so it was busy. But, I was young. I saw this as all, new to me. Let me give you a little short story. I grew up in the East LA area of Los Angeles. And when I got on the job, I actually thought the West Side was the city of Los Angeles. And when I got on the job, I found out the West Side was, where UCLA was, and I didn't realize I was a minority until I got into the police department, because where I grew up, we were a majority. And all of a sudden I get in the police department, I turned out to be a minority officer. So a lot of things were going down there. It's basically the Los Angeles Police Department was everybody that was teaching me, or everybody that was in the police department. A lot of them were had been on since 1946, 45. A lot of them were old time. What I would say the old time, there was a lot of male whites. It was male white dominated police department. And even for me to get in, as a Latino, that was something. But there was a lot of changes going on, a lot of things happening. The police department was changing. The police department was being accused of a lot of things, and it was just a turbulent time for the police department, public, and everything. So,
Evan, maybe you could elaborate a little. I mean, here you had a situation where 1963 President Kennedy is assassinated. April of 1968, Martin Luther King, our great civil rights leader, is assassinated. And then just 3 months later, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. Talk about the impact of, especially the culmination maybe with the Robert Kennedy assassination. How did it affect this nation and the future of our nation?
I think a lot of people were really seared by 1968. It had a kind of this is maybe too strong, but a pre-revolutionary feel. There had been, when King was killed, there were riots in 68 American cities that night. This is April 1968. There were riots at the Democratic Convention in 1968. Some would say it was a police riot, actually. It was the allegation that the Mayor Daley's cops were a little too tough on the demonstrators. But it was a chaotic scene. And it was frightening. There was a lot of student unrest. Campuses were really in revolt. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement had stirred up the country. And President Nixon actually benefited from this, his so-called silent majority. These were Americans who wanted law and order. They wanted an end to riots and crazy students and hippies and all that. They wanted law and order, and Nixon ran on that and won. I'm not sure if Bobby Kennedy had survived that he would have won. I mean, it's easy to say now, the great martyr hero. First of all, I'm not sure he would have gotten the nomination, because in those days the Democratic Party was still run by the bosses, and the bosses favored Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president. He had many more delegates going into Chicago. So, maybe Bobby could have, by the sheer passion and energy of his campaign and his popularity, could have turned it around and convinced the bosses that he was the guy, but it was not a sure thing. Fred Dutton, Bobby's bodyguard, told me that. And even if he had won the nomination, Nixon was a formidable candidate running on this law and order ticket, because Bobby Kennedy was a hot guy, not that great on TV. There was steam coming off of him, and he was a little scary. And people thought, is he going to stir things up? He might have stirred things up in a good way, but he was an agitator. He was a radical in his own way. And so I'm not convinced that he would have won in 1968.
But certainly that night he had a lot of momentum.
He did.
California was big.
He did. And you could argue these things endlessly, and there's a lot of mythology about it. He was a great, I was saying in my book that he was in the process of becoming great. He had been a good attorney general. He had taken on organized crime. Nobody else had done that. He had taken on the civil rights movement. He persuaded his brother in 1963 to introduce what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Johnson gets the credit for it because he passed it. But the person who introduced that bill was John F. Kennedy, 1963. Now think about this for a second. The base of the Democratic Party was the Solid South. By introducing that civil rights bill, Kennedy is basically kissing off the base of his party. How many politicians today would do that? Just if you think about the electoral math on this, and he wasn't all that happy about it, but Bobby goaded and prodded his brother that this was the right thing to do. And in June of 1963, President Kennedy went on national television to call for a Civil Rights Act. We forget, 1963, black people could not go to the bathroom to restaurants to hotels. The South was completely segregated not so long ago. And we needed federal legislation to change that. We got it, but Jack Kennedy was the guy who introduced it, and he said, we have a moral obligation, he said, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution, to do something about this. And it was a politically very brave thing to do. The Kennedys, if that was all they did, deserve credit for that kind of political courage. Again, I'm not seeing a whole lot of that in our current political environment. And the Kennedys were very political. I don't mean to say that they were very political, but they did a brave thing on this, and they did a lot of brave things. Bobby Kennedy was a brave person. There's no question about that, precisely because he was frightened. He overcame his own fear, his own fear of death. He was very fatalistic about getting shot. He had many conversations in the spring of 1968 where people warned him that he was going to be killed. One time there was supposedly a rifleman seen on the roof. His advisor said, "You got to go out the back." He said, No, I'm going out the front door. I'm going out the front door. I got to show that I'm not afraid. And that's the way he was. He was a brave guy, as I say, and I think in the process of becoming a great man, but we'll never know.
I think you write in your book, by the way, I was reading an excerpt that talked about he did a lot of that. He was the gritty, courageous guy in part because his father thought he was weak.
Yeah.
And he grew up with that kind of
wanted to show
issue, if you will.
Yeah.
Yes.
They called him the runt of the family. He described himself as a little kid. He's actually I talk about him to school students because his brother Jack was glamorous, and his sister Kick and Joe Jr., they were known as the Golden Trio, and they were good-looking and popular and athletic. And Bobby was this little guy, by his own description, fell down a lot, dropped things, was depressed. His brother Jack called him Black Robert. He got kicked out of high school for cheating. He was not a good athlete. He was a fierce athlete. He was a C.D. student. He had everything going against him. But he found in his own weakness strength. He was unlike, more than the other members of his family, he was able to reach out to poor people, to the dispossessed, to people who were left behind. He understood juvenile delinquents, as they were called in those days, kids like him who had been forgotten in some way or had a lot of strikes against them. Now, it's hard to... Bobby Kennedy was a very rich, privileged kid, but he had a way of reaching across class and money, reaching out to people who had nothing and who voted for him. I mean, there are photographs of him. I mean, when he drove through a black area of town, he was mobbed by these black kids running along. They loved him because they sensed in him his empathy. He was able to convey that through his speeches, his body language, his manner, and it came from being what they called the runt of the family. He had an empathy that the other Kennedys, lacked, and it made him. It was the key to, I think, the beginning of his greatness.
Excellent. Other questions? Jerry, wait for our microphone, if you will.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the panel. Evan, I have to disagree with you. From those of us from Massachusetts would say that Bobby Kennedy probably would have been a great candidate for president, but thank you. This, I guess, goes to badge number 3909. As someone who's entering his final year in 32 years of service, I want to thank you for your service, Arthur, and quite a stellar career, and thank you for being here this evening. At the risk of sounding like a person who's what do you call it? The people, conspiracy theorists. You mentioned a great point, which was there was an 8-shot 22. And during that time, there was a security officer who was working that evening, who also had a gun in the Ambassador Hotel, a gun that's allegedly never been recovered. There was also allegedly 13 shots in the Ambassador Hotel. And I think the irony of this whole story is that the Ambassador Hotel is not what Dealey Plaza is or what the JFK assassination is, where you have a museum that's made. It was torn down to be a school, I believe it is today, by one of the victims who I think is a doctor today. I think that's probably something that Bobby Kennedy would have probably wanted, but yet it takes away, I think, from what we're here today to talk about, which is history. And I think if you could expound upon Was that security guard armed, and were there more than 8 shots fired within the building?
Oh, well, again, I was a probationary officer, and basically I didn't have anything to do with that investigation, other than my part. And I know what you're talking about, because they said there was more shots, but this has been there's books been written on this, right? There's books been written on this about how many shots and about that security guard, and I don't know. I didn't even about the gun. I mean, I can't see a security guard carrying a .22. I would expect them to carry a .38 because that's what we used to carry back then. I have to tell you, I don't know. All I know is what I saw. And I saw this .22 long bullet in his pocket, one. And I know that the gun that was used was an Ivor Johnson .22 8-shot revolver. And I know that's in custody. And that is now a school. And at the time, they wanted to make it some type of a memorial, that pantry area. And but the school board, they decided to just knock it down, and it's now a school. I think it's even called the Robert F. Kennedy School. And it's still there. I mean, it's right there on 3400 Wilshire. But, I wish I could say, hey, you think about it, and I'm thinking, God, why couldn't I have had 2 or 3 years on the job? I mean, it would have been completely different what I've asked them, what I've talked to them, what I've done. But, I just happened to only have 3 weeks. So basically, I was just being told, I was doing what I was told. And, hindsight, maybe I should have done a lot of other things, but, they talk about that Sirhan was, maybe crazy or maybe whatever, but I don't know. You think about, with everything going on, this guy was able to take a look at my badge and say 3909. I mean, he must have had something going with him. I mean, so, it's, now when I think about it, I can, think about it all the time when I'm asked, and usually this happens about this time every year. But all I know is what I did, and it happened when I was 3 weeks on a job, and like anything can happen at any time. You just at the right place at the right time, and you're a part of history, or nothing really happens, and I keep saying and I know my wife's going to get on me about that.
Art, one thing that I don't think we covered here, but you've certainly told me in earlier conversation, is that, and this is striking to me, that you mentioned the timeline. By the time you got there, got Sirhan out of there, it might have been as long as a half hour or more, perhaps, from the time you got the call, from the time of the shooting at 12:15 a.m. on Pacific time, June 5th, 1968. You said when you took Sirhan out of there, Bobby Kennedy was still lying in the pool of blood there on the floor. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, the first person taken out of there was Sirhan. And he was the first, because we were in there, we walked right in. We got him, we arrested him, we took him out. Bobby Kennedy and the other victims were farther down into the pantry area. But like I said, we didn't know that because there were so many people there.
And it should be noted, as you alluded to there, that 5 other people were actually shot and injured in that shooting incident. Bobby Kennedy was the only one who died. And I was also interested to read that Rosemary Clooney apparently was there, a fervent Bobby Kennedy supporter, and she was taken away to the hospital because of a nervous breakdown after the event. She was not shot. But a lot of celebrities there. George Plimpton was there, for example, among many others. So the Kennedy aura certainly affected a lot of people, and a lot of people were very hurt by what happened that night. Other questions from the audience?
This is for Mr. Thomas, and it has an indirect relationship, especially to our museum. What did your research show when Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General about his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover?
It was pretty bad. Hoover was a force unto himself. He had lived through a lot of presidents, and he kept his power through a number of means. But one of those means was having a file on whoever was in office, and this was a problem for Bobby Kennedy because Bobby wanted the FBI to get into the organized crime game, which it had not done, and they did. They did get him in the end. And he wanted the FBI to get involved in civil rights, and they did. But he had trouble controlling Hoover. Hoover had some pushback. And this gets a little complicated, but Hoover had a way of sending memos over to the attorney generals just to let him know what he knew. And one thing that he knew was that the President of the United States had shared a girlfriend with the head of the mob in Chicago, Momo Giancana. Judith Exner was her name. Jack Kennedy had a lot of girlfriends, and one of them was a mafia mob, and the head of the FBI knew that, and that was a pretty embarrassing fact, and that was good job security for J. Edgar Hoover when that memo went across. He also pushed Kennedy for authority to wiretap Martin Luther King, and this gets very complicated, but he had some ability to force Kennedy to do it because there's another woman named Ellen Romesh who was alleged to have had sex with President Kennedy, who was also alleged to be an East German spy. And RFK and his buddies got her out of the country, but during the Bobby Baker scandal, her name came up, and Bobby Kennedy needed Hoover to go to the Hill and say, stop this investigation. The price for that was permission to wiretap King. And you can't really make this stuff up. I mean, it's just, if you're doing a Hollywood movie, you can't make it up. So the Hoover was able to essentially blackmail the president and his brother. Bobby Kennedy hated this, of course. Didn't like, would demand that Hoover come see him. Usually the procedure was the attorney general went to see the director. Bobby would insist that the director come see him. They were in the same building in those days. Hoover didn't like that. So it was a test of wills. I would have said if Bobby Kennedy was elected president, the first person he'd fire would be Hoover. But I'm not sure of that, because that file was still in Hoover's drawer.
If I may, I know that you had asked a question about the ambulance and when Bobby Kennedy was taken. And I was just thinking that at the time, Central Receiving Hospital was the main hospital in that area where they used to dispatch the ambulances from. And that Central Receiving Hospital was about 2 miles from the Ambassador Hotel. So when that call came out, ambulance shooting, that ambulance would have been dispatched to the Ambassador Hotel, because we usually get the calls about the same time. And then since there was a shooting involved, we had victims. So I'm thinking that what happened was that probably right after we had left, the ambulances got there, or ambulance got there, and that's when they probably took Kennedy right out. So he probably was out of there maybe 20 minutes after we left, because when we left, they had not got there yet.
I think we need to wrap up, and let me just offer a few closing comments. Again, fascinating discussion. So many facts and the stories associated with this assassination. You mentioned, Art, the role that fate plays in a law enforcement's career, and I think we could argue the same here in the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Not only did it have an amazing effect on your career as a law enforcement professional, but it certainly had a major impact on our nation at the time, and certainly moving forward into the future years, as Evan and others have alluded to. The fact of the matter is, Bobby Kennedy, after he gave his speech, his victory speech, was intending to go meet with some supporters in another part of the hotel when the press clamored for him to come speak to them at a press conference. So he was actually rerouted at the last minute through that kitchen area where he was assassinated, and we can only speculate as to whether or not Sirhan, if he didn't get him that night, would he have tried again? We'll never know the answer to that. Sirhan was tried a year later His defense by his attorneys was diminished responsibilities, meaning he was not clear-headed when he did it. In fact, Sirhan Sirhan to this day says he does not recall the incident at all, and that's his story, and he's sticking to it. And the bottom line is he never denied shooting and killing Robert Kennedy, and he never indicated that there was a conspiracy of any sort. Those are attorneys that are now making that argument on his behalf. Let me say this. I was moved truly, as all of us, I think, were at the time, Ted Kennedy's eulogy to his brother. And I'll just quote an excerpt from it. It says, "My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not." Tonight, on the 44th anniversary of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, I want to thank the panelists who joined us here tonight, Evan Thomas, Art Placencia, Steve Hughes, for sharing their perspective of this historic event and the impact it had on their lives and on the nation. I certainly want to thank our sponsors from Target who sponsor our series called Witness to History. Brad Brecky is here with us tonight representing Target. I also want to recognize a couple of dignitaries with us here tonight. We have Todd Jones, director of ATF, is here, as well as Teresa Chambers, the chief of the U.S. Park Police, among many other notables here in the audience. So I thank all of you for sharing in this very special evening. As I said earlier, this will be preserved on film for posterity's sake. Hundreds of years from now, people will be listening to the recollections and the comments made here tonight about this milestone in law enforcement and in American history.
We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.